degradation in play. It is something that has been talked about and something that they want. We'll get into that. There's going to be an entire episode just on that and the psychology behind it and whether or not it's healthy, because a lot of people make serious arguments. Well, any man or any woman that would either want to do this or have this done to them must have major psychological issues. Well, many studies have been done regarding one specific fantasy, and that would be a rape fantasy. And it found that a very large percentage of women have a rape fantasy. A very large percentage of women have a rape fantasy. Now, does that mean it's okay to go out and rape women? Absolutely not. But if you're in a relationship with a woman, and these are women also, by the way, several studies, part of being able to enter this study was a complete sexual history, psychological profile. They were wanting to find out if it was only abused women that had this fantasy so that they could relive it and work through it, or feel the chemistry that was flowing during it, because that does all kinds of crazy things. Again, I'm not really going to get into that, but what they found was that a large percentage of what psychiatrists, psychologists considered to be healthy individuals have this rape fetish or fantasy. A fetish and a fantasy, two totally different things. So scratch the fetish part, but this fantasy. And again, I'm not advocating this type of play. If this is going to be done, it needs to be something that is done after a whole lot of discussion. If there is any history of abuse on either person's history, in either person's history, there needs to be professional therapy sought out first, and make sure, because at that point, you're rocking the boat there on the sane part, because it can do a lot of damage. And I never encourage newbies to play with this at all. Do not do it. It is extremely risky. Stick with the lighter side, ease yourself into it, and trust me, it will be a whole lot more enjoyable experience for you and your partner or partners. So be very careful with that particular one. Anyway, so there's 50 Shades of Grey as modern influence. Back in the 90s, the vampire movies, which reemerged as Twilight, and I just refuse to consider that an influence into the BDSM community. But I remember when Interview with a Vampire came out, and the whole Lestat series of books by Anne Rice that movie was based on, there being a huge uproar by, I believe it was the Southern Baptist, about it, promoted homosexuality, blah, 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 promoted just this and that and everything bad. And they wanted to look at Louis and Lestat, played by Tom Cruise and Brad Pitt. Brad Pitt was Louis, Tom Cruise was Lestat, and make that a big dirty homosexual thing. And who cares? That's what I was thinking the whole time, was who cares? It's a good movie. It was a good book. It was a good series. But nevertheless, because of their protest of this movie, it actually tied it more into the BDSM community with the fetish of vampirism. And I touched on this last week, but it was a major influence in the 90s. And the DS relationship that they had, Lestat was dominant over Louis until he finally was able to break free of it. And that was an unhealthy form of a DS relationship. There's a lot more. The Story of O, that's an old book, but it was a very, very good book. There's been quite a few written. Get on Amazon, look them up. As far as specific or genre-specific books, there are tons and tons and tons of them. I used to work at a bookstore. I was an assistant manager shortly after high school of a discount bookstore, and we got books in that were written in the early 1900s. Obviously they were reprints. They were classic eroticas, and this was not an adult bookstore. This was actually a Christian owned bookstore, but yet they had this old erotica, which I was quite proud of them for carrying it, but they did it because it was classic works. So I started reading these novels, and they were short, small little paperback, 200 pages, and that was just a few years after I had been introduced to the lifestyle by Makita. So I picked up several things from those books that, come to find out, those were the wrong things to pick up. Now, why do I say this? Is just to reiterate, be careful what you're looking at. If you want to read it just for the sake of reading it, fine, go ahead. But be very careful. And it's really easy to tell which ones are okay to take from and which ones aren't. If the dominant master top has love and respect for the submissive or the bottom or the slave, and there is communication and everything is lined out, then chances are it's a pretty good read. If there's not, and most of them it's not going to be in there, so you have to remember that this is going on behind the scenes. But if there are instances of abuse, just read it for fiction. That's all I can say. The next thing on my list to get into is the psychological aspects, and I've touched on that a little bit. However, as I said last week, and it's one of the main reasons why I'm doing this podcast, is not only do I have the BDSM experience and I want to get it out there. This podcast comes from my frustration with the misunderstanding and the misinformation that is in our country and in this world about something that is absolutely amazing if it's done correctly, and that is for some people. It is not for everyone. I will be the first person to say that. This way of life is not for everyone, and that's perfectly fine. If you're listening to this and you're just enjoying it, it's not for you. Thank you. I greatly appreciate that, because you're finding a topic interesting, even though, would you want to put it into your life? No. But you're still becoming educated, and that's the important thing. Whenever we stop learning, we start dying in the mind. So the psychological aspect, I believe that everybody can benefit from therapy. I have participated in therapy a few times in my life, and I have no embarrassment in saying that. It looked like there for a while therapy was going to be the trendy thing to do, and amongst Hollywood it was, but that just goes to show the power of stigma, because mental illness has such a stigma in our society that even though Hollywood was doing it, it still didn't dare trickle down into the middle class or below, because I can't let people see me going in to see a therapist. There's nothing wrong with it. It doesn't mean that you're sick and twisted or crazy. It means that you recognize that you're human, and chances are, by about 100%, if you're hearing this, you're human. If you're hearing this and comprehending it anyway, then you're human. So there's nothing wrong with it, and I highly recommend it. Couples counseling, that's something that I have talked to a lot of people in the BDSM community about, is couples counseling. And yes, it can be difficult to find a therapist or counselor that is, okay at best with BDSM, that understands it. Most people you're not going to find, or most people will not find a church counselor that is going to go, oh, sure, yeah, I tie my wife up every night, or she ties me up every night. There again, if anybody says it's every night, there's a good chance they're lying about that, because we all know how relationships go. Just because if I had a 24/7 slave that lived with me, submissive, if that makes you feel more comfortable. If I had a 24/7 submissive that lived with me because of work and house chores, it wouldn't be any different than the relationship between myself and my wife. We have things to do. Now, my wife and I, we have a very healthy sexual relationship. She is vanilla, and that does not mean that the sex is bad. That doesn't mean that I enjoy it any less. But I'm not really going to get into detail about my wife or our sex life, just in that it's not at all bad. However, like with any relationship, life can get in the way. And it is important to me, it's important to her that we not allow that to take place. And I talk to couples who have been together, as long as she and I have, which is 15 years, who haven't had sex in 5 years because they've just become so used to not that they have become embarrassed again to have that chemistry, basically. And they've become friends. And that is a very thin line in a relationship when it comes to maintaining that friendship. My wife is my best friend. And then also on the flip side of that, which is the sexual relationship, walking that line to where you don't fall into the friend zone. It's not just all about sex. And a vanilla relationship and a BDSM relationship is no different. A DS relationship is no different. Life happens, and we can't prevent it. And that brings me to religious aspects. And last week I said that the transgender porn star that I'm going to interview, she lives in Canada, a very famous one that is really big into BDSM. And the preacher that I talked about, wanting to interview them together, when I said that they agree on most things, they are both coming from a spiritual aspect. And that's another thing, is neither one of them likes the term religious or religion. So it's very interesting. But the religious aspect, DS, is spoken about, not by name, but is spoken about in the Bible. The Bible calls for wives, submit to your husband. On the flip side of that, it says husbands, love your wives. And that's one of the big problems here in the South, is that men, and I don't mean this offensively, but it is true. If you're from the South and you're listening to this and you're about to get pissed off, hear me out. Because if you look around, you'll know that I'm telling the truth. I'm not putting down the South. But I hear it quoted often by men. My wife is not obeying the word of God because she is not submitting to my every command. I have a dog named Eli. Eli is half German Shepherd, half Golden Retriever. So he's a Golden Shepherd or a German Retriever, however you want to see it. Eli is also trained as a service dog to work with autistic children. Now, Eli is stubborn when he is not in his harness that he would wear to work with these autistic children. Just like any service dog, they have a special harness. When you put that on him, he snaps to attention. He is very obedient. He still has a bit of a stubborn streak, but even that goes away if there's a child around. And he is a very beautiful, statuesque little dog. And you would think with them being part German Shepherd, part Golden Retriever, he'd be, 80 pounds or so. No, he's like 46 pounds. He's a runt. He's very cute. I love that dog. But I would never say about him that he needs to submit to my every will. And these guys that I hear say that about their wives certainly wouldn't say that about their dogs. Now, part of DS is women being the tops, being the masters, or in this case, they're called mistresses, or dominatrix, domes, the dominants. Certainly that doesn't follow those teachings from biblical times, but it works for some people. And who are we to judge? Stay out of my house and don't tell me what is okay once that door to the outside world closes once I walk in. And that's how it needs to be thought of. So as far as the religious aspect of BDSM goes, yes, there are things in the Bible that promote it. There are things in history. A lot of the hymns, and I forget the woman, not Geraldine, maybe it was Geraldine, I can't remember her last name, that would flog herself and walk through this, basically a maze that was in the floor of the church. And she wrote these hymns. She entered into a trance state and would write these hymns. And some of these are still being sang in churches today. Now, floggings, that's the most common thing that most people think about. They think about a dominatrix dressed in a leather or PVC latex corset and thigh-high boots with 6-inch stiletto heels, standing over a man on his hands and knees in a diaper or a pair of leather underwear or something, buttless chaps, with a collar and her holding the leash in one hand and a riding crop in the other hand, usually with her standing there in some very sexually provocative manner. Yeah, that's a very common first thought when someone says BDSM. It's either that or flogging. Anytime I ask somebody, hey, what's your first